Through studies of Zen Buddhism and observations of accomplished statesmen, he has developed a kind of empirical model of right speech.
Mm.
Its central tenet might be stated as right speech is wholesome. It's good for the speaker, it's good for the listener. David himself is a master of right speech in my experience. His formal title is Senior Counsel at Ballard Spahr Limited Liability Practice. He practices media and constitutional law. He also teaches media law as a professor of practice at UA's College of Law. If I go on much longer, he won't have time to speak. And so I'd like to let him share with us his thoughts on how to avoid the pitfalls of activist speech.
Mm.
We have seen in times of conflict how tension and disdain can limit progress and even turn our friends into enemies. And David will talk about ways we might help turn enemies into friends. So thank you, David. I will be monitoring as best I can the chat and raise hands and so on. Would you like to just have a straight run and then take questions, or do you like people to jump in as you go?
Either is fine. If
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
All right.
And let's go.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you everyone for attending this talk on free speech, right speech, and the sustainability of our planet. Mark Twain had this to say about finding the right words. I quote, "The difference between the almost right word and the right word is really a large matter. 'Tis the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning. Some words are like lightning, capable of setting a world on fire. We seem to be invoking inflammatory language a lot these days. And why not be heard? We value our First Amendment rights of free speech and free press. We find them enshrined in the Constitution. We protect and valorize these freedoms. But is unfettered speech, angry, polarizing, disparaging speech, skillful speech? Is it wise or effective speech? Does it come from a place of moral clarity? What exactly is wise speech, effective speech, kind and even loving speech? And what does American law, if anything, have to say in support of skillful speech? What might our faith traditions contribute to an advocacy that seeks to sustain life on our precious planet? For as confident as we may be in the necessity of prioritizing environmental protection, there will surely be countervailing interests and strong voices to promote those interests. For many, jobs. For some, profits. Fear and greed can generate speech and conduct that endanger us all. So, how do we address those concerns? How do we speak out and act to sustain life on Earth without devolving into antagonistic camps of winners and losers? It begins, I believe, by resisting the temptation to think we have all the answers, right? That they who oppose our views are the enemy, and that the situation is now hopeless. As Abraham Lincoln said to Congress in 1862, and I quote, "As our case is new, so must we think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." So, with President Lincoln's words in mind, let's take a brief look at the law of free speech, the history of free speech in our country, very briefly. From time immemorial, free speech has been recognized as an indispensable weapon in the fight against oppression. But the longer I have lived with that absolutist view, the more I have become aware that free speech can actually be a weapon of oppression too. So how does the law try to balance these competing concerns? Well, over the past 100 years or so, the U.S. Supreme Court has actively defined the boundaries of the First Amendment, determining what government can and cannot regulate in terms of speech and publication. While the First Amendment fundamentally limits government power to curtail expression, free speech is not absolute, and exceptions exist for defamation, obscenity, incitement, and other claims. The court has allowed content neutral time, place, and manner restrictions, but generally prohibits censorship based on viewpoint. A pivotal era in the 1960s saw the US Supreme Court issue landmark decisions asserting that public debate must be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. These words come from a celebrated case by the US Supreme Court, New York Times versus Sullivan, decided in 1964. It may be on the current Supreme Court's chopping block. There has been talk by at least two, if not three, of our justices about reviewing whether New York Times versus Sullivan makes sense today. It required public officials to prove actual malice, knowledge of falsity, or reckless disregard for the truth by clear and convincing evidence before a public official could successfully sue for libel. The court wanted to create breathing room for the press. It extended broad protection, in another case, even to hateful speech, advocating illegal action in a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio, another case from the 60s, demanding proof of advocacy that is likely to incite or produce imminent lawless action. This body of highly speech protective jurisprudence has created a legal climate where a wide range of expression, including false and malicious speech, is legally protected today. And the media scene of the 1960s seems almost quaint when compared with what's happening today. We now inhabit a legal landscape governed by Section 230 of the Federal Communications Decency Act that confers sweeping immunity to providers or users of an interactive computer service for publication of content provided by third-party users. In other words, by limiting the liability of social media companies for what their users post online, Congress has unleashed a Wild West for the purveyors of every kind of speech imaginable. Today in America, as Marianne Franks writes in her book, Fearless Speech, and I quote, "Pornographers have a First Amendment right to glorify sexual violence for profit. Businesses have a First Amendment right to deny service to gay people and to advertise this fact. Anti-abortion zealots have a First Amendment right to mislead pregnant women with fake pregnancy clinics and a First Amendment right to harass women attempting to access actual care. Corporations have a First Amendment right to spend unlimited funds to influence elections." Close quote, and so it goes. Harmful speech is justified variously under the First Amendment, often by a principle of protecting freedom for the thought we hate. Perhaps the formulations of our free speech rights 50 or 100 years ago still ring true, but in many ways, the views of yesteryear land in a very different world today, where the work of journalists is being replaced by algorithms, artificial intelligence, and bots, what Yuval Noah Harari calls aliens. He said, People increasingly get their news from social media sources that profit from polarization and traffic in traumatizing messages, controlled by some of the largest concentrations of wealth in the world. I quote, "It is no coincidence that the democratic conversation is breaking down all over the world because the algorithms are hijacking it. We have the most sophisticated information technology in all of history, and we are losing the ability to talk with one another, to hold a reasoned conversation." Well, there's a little bit of the legal landscape. So, what might concepts of right speech or skillful speech have to say on the subject? How might they advance our ability to say and do the right thing, to preserve our precious planet? We have to embrace what Stephen Batchelor has called an ethics of care whenever we speak. And it must be every bit as careful as our efforts to sustain the earth, life on earth. At the risk of making a secular audience turn and run, I think it's instructive to ask what our faith traditions have to say about wise or skillful speech. And it's worthwhile to observe that they all call for wise speech and eschew false and malicious speech. The Old Testament, quote, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." The New Testament, "For a person that will love life and see good days, let them refrain their tongue from evil and their lips that they speak no guile." From the Bhagavad Gita, quote, "Nonviolence, truth, aversion to fault finding, modesty, these are the treasures of a path of a person who is born for heaven. Deceitfulness, insolence, self conceit, anger, harshness, and ignorance, these belong for a person who is born for hell." And from Islam, the tongue is called the mirror of the heart. A wise Arab proverb says, "Every war begins with words." From Taoism, quote, "Express yourself completely, then keep quiet. Be like the forces of nature. When it blows, there is only wind. When it rains, there is only rain. And when the clouds pass, the sun shines through." From the Tao. And from Buddhism, permit me to linger not on a religion so much as an ethics of care. Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha's abiding attention to the ethics of right speech, suggests we might carefully consider its meaning, especially in these times of divisive, incessant, instantaneous global communications. What then is this wise speech in a digital world, and how does it relate to free speech? Well, if we begin with the Buddha's question and answer, what, friends, is right speech? Abstaining from false speech, abstaining from malicious speech, abstaining from harsh speech, and abstaining from idle chatter. This is called right speech. Wrong speech, if you will, happens when we communicate in ways that are false, malicious, harsh, and hollow. But the terms right and wrong suggest a bright line, one size fits all approach to wise speech. Right speech, in the context of Buddhist ethics, means skillful speech. And skillful speech is as situational as each of life's new situations. So, unlike the American law of free speech, which tells us what the government can and cannot regulate, punish, and proscribe, skillful speech provides an ethical framework for communicating with ourselves and with others. In Buddhism, skillful speech means deciding whether and when to speak and what we should say along the way. I'm reminded of the acronym WAIT, WAIT, which stands for Why am I talking? But with your permission, I'll go on a few more minutes. Because here's where it gets tricky. Right speech involves the formulation of an appropriate response to life's ever-changing situations. Sometimes that response is silence. Other times, as Dr. King said, silence is betrayal. It's time to go out and march. By and large, right speech is personal and situational, but not cynical. It requires continuous practice, in the words of 13th century Zen teacher Eihai Dogen, though he may not have been referring expressly to right speech when he wrote of continuous practice. But still, from silent illumination of continuous practice comes a depth of understanding beyond words. And yet we must find the words and use them skillfully. That's because the understanding that comes from our practice is what connects our separate selves to all other sentient beings, to the world's more than sentient beings, and to all life itself. These are the connections that allow us to recognize the importance of kind and loving speech, compassionate and courageous communications, fearless speech, noble silence, and deep listening, and more broadly, practicing an ethics of care. If we stop and pause before we speak, we increase the odds of formulating an appropriate response, one that considers its consequences for the speaker and the hearer, for all the world, and resonates with kindness. Sometimes it's symbolic speech, as wordless as a smile. For as Thich Nhat Hanh has observed, quote, a smile is the most basic kind of piecework. And yes, laughter has its place in right speech too, especially when it comes from the heart. Over time, with continuous practice, wise speech unfolds authentically. Consider these turning words found in a book of the same title by Hosan Allen Senaki, attributed to Karen Dakotas. Quote, there is a simple lesson I learned from Karen some years ago. Very simple. Ask yourself, do you want to be right or do you want to be in connection? In Zen, we have what's known as the 5 gatekeepers of speech. As Roshi Joan Halifax has explained in her book, Standing at the Edge, Finding Freedom Where Fear and Courage Meet, before we open our mouths, we consider. So if you're looking for a list, here's a list of 5. 1, is it true? 2, is it kind? 3, is it beneficial? 4, is it necessary? And 5, is it the right time? Is it true, kind, beneficial, necessary? Is it the right time? From Thich Nhat Hanh again, loving speech requires telling the truth in such a way that it benefits others, the world, and ourselves. When we tell the truth, we do so with compassion. We speak in such a way that the hearer can accept what we're saying. Perhaps that's another formulation of these 5 points. Let's consider for just a minute the Buddha's directive to abstain from lying. Buddhism is not alone among the faith traditions in eschewing false speech. Search the Abrahamic and East Asian traditions, and we find injunctions against lying in them all. But even here, a bright line may prove elusive. As Lynn Jensen wrote in a Tricycle magazine essay titled, Right Lying, right speech isn't a matter of, quote, and this is her speaking, isn't a matter of telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. We cannot say definitively, this is a lie, without consulting the intent and probable consequence of what is spoken. Zen rests on seeking the heart's consent, and it does so because the truth or falsehood of what we say resides in the totality of the circumstances and in whether the words are consistent with the facts. For one thing, in the world of facts, there's generally more than one fact that bears on what is best to say in any given circumstance. The heart's truth makes a marriage of opposites. Now, Jensen's essay on right lying is no pretext for perjury. Rather, it's analogous to what we say about meditating. Simple, but not easy. For what is the heart's consent, if not an appropriate response to life's most challenging questions and situations? And how do we formulate an appropriate response to a friend's query, a colleague's comment, or a nation's participation in war or genocide? We should follow our thoughts and consider without judgment where they take us. Our passing thoughts often lead to speech, and speech leads to action. Our contemporary culture of saying whatever pops into our heads and then posting it seldom represents an appropriate response. It may generate the most hits, reflective of one's immediate attractions and aversions, but rarely is it wise speech. How do we practice wise and compassionate speech and foster a loving community? Hate speech, though not proscribed by our Constitution, can lead to catastrophic actions. In Dogen's fascicle, The Bodhisattva's Four Methods of Guidance, he understood the merit of kind speech. Kind speech means that when you see sentient beings, you arouse the heart of compassion and offer words of loving care. It is contrary to cruel or violent speech. In this fascicle, Dogen recognized the enormous consequence of words and the importance of choosing them wisely. Quote, know that kind speech arises from kind heart, and kind heart from the seed of compassionate heart. Ponder the fact that kind speech is not just praising the merit of others, it has the power to turn the destiny of a nation. Close quote. A few concluding thoughts. Right speech involves care and risk. It's compassionate and fearless, imbued with values of kindness and courage. Kindness encouraged that the law of free speech neither favors nor necessarily protects. If, as Cornel West has said, quote, justice is what love looks like in public, then it's time to practice more right speech in the public square, and it won't be easy. As Joan Halifax wrote in Standing at the Edge, quote, in cases of injustice, of disrespect, of harm, of abuse, of harassment, of violence, it is our responsibility to call out harm in the name of compassion. Right speech is courageous speech, she noted, grounded in authentic respect. Today, the forces of greed, hate, and delusion may seem overwhelming to us. The challenges may feel especially daunting in view of our rapid-fire digital ecosystem, a climate catastrophe, an 18th century constitutional structure moving too slowly to adapt, and a rising authoritarianism that traffics in harsh and hateful speech. But our faith traditions, and I've focused on Buddhism, teach us that wise speech plays an important role in our daily lives, whether we're practicing noble silence or shouting from the rooftops. And free speech gives us plenty of space to exercise our ethics wisely. To everything there is a season, Ecclesiastes reminds us, and this wisdom applies to speech in the digital age. Newspapers may be folding, but there's no dearth of information. The purveyors of goods and services, with bits of news sandwiched in between, are filling our social media shopping carts with all kinds of mental food. Some of it's useful, some of it's toxic. If we're not careful, we can become gluttons of news feed, feeling sick from the sights and sounds. Or we can disengage entirely, becoming news aesthetics, abandoning our duty as citizens. Just as the founders sought balance between freedom and security for a new nation, we must find balance in our individual lives between being well-informed citizens and overindulged or turned off users. To prepare ourselves for practicing right speech in these times, there is a time for taking a news fast, but then we must return, bear witness, and take compassionate action. So just wrapping up, I mentioned a case, it's one of my favorites in the law, and it's very speech protective, decided in 1964. I heard Andrew Young at a talk say that this case by the Supreme Court in 1964 actually gave rise to a successful civil rights movement in this country because it enabled the New York Times and basically all the media from northern cities mostly to venture down south and show America what was happening in the streets of cities like Birmingham. And the lawsuit, New York Times versus Sullivan, was spawned by a newspaper ad, and it carried the title, Heed Their Rising Voices. In many ways, so the newspaper was not sued over anything it had originally published. They published an ad, and it was an advertisement in support of the movement to help pay for the legal expenses of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others, who were also sued by the Times and found liable, ultimately a sum worth many millions of dollars today. So they took the case to the Supreme Court. Heed their rising voices, indeed. In many ways, the Sullivan case and the freedom to report on oppressive conditions in this country made some of the later successes of the civil rights movement possible. Within months of this decision, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law, and the Voting Rights Act followed a year later. And 60 years after that, this Supreme Court eviscerated it. But that's another discussion. Of course, the causes and conditions of American life in the 1960s are not the same as today. And yet, Heed Their Rising Voices may be an appropriate anthem for the present moment when democratic values, human rights, and the well-being of our planet are under siege. And a culture of fear is gripping people all around the world. Right speech is part of a living process that includes our thoughts, speech, and actions. We can start small, using loving and kind speech in our private lives, and then extend our expressions of care for the world to encompass our speech in public as well. When we find our voice, right speech leads to right action. We all have something useful to say, if only we have the wisdom to know when and how to say it. Fortunately, free speech in this country still gives us the breathing room to get it said. Not all of our speech will light up the night sky, but when we do communicate, what values will guide us? Will we remember the 5 gatekeepers of right speech? Will we choose an appropriate response? The choice is ours. Will we use words that illuminate or that set the house on fire? just a few questions for us tonight. Thank you for your kind listening. Thank you. Thank you. And I think I may have seen a question pop up
Yes.
that I'm too digitally illiterate to chance answering while I spoke.
David Stein, did you have a question earlier? No, okay. I'll start off and feel free to put yours into the chat, or again, raise your hand. What would be an example of right speech that isn't what we consider classically nice? Be right speech.
Well, they're not mutually exclusive. Right speech can be classically nice, but it's very situational. There may be times when we have a duty to say words to friends and foes that they would rather not hear, and yet we have to say it. I think of my daughter, who saw an older male employee in the workplace approaching a younger female, a subordinate, in ways that were harassing. And it was clear to her that the young woman in the situation didn't know what to say. And she took it upon herself to step in, and I don't remember exactly what she said or how she said it, but she approached her friend in a way that effectively broke up the conversation. And she then actually went to her employer to say that this individual was not speaking appropriately in the workplace. His behavior was really harassing behavior. That takes courage. Um, it takes courage. It's hard. And just as a form of admission, for the longest time, I would be reluctant to speak up when I heard something that was inappropriate. It seemed like it might be adding friction to a situation that could become even more volatile. Now I'm convinced that we really do have a duty with right speech to protect and illuminate in ways that may be uncomfortable for us all in the moment, but may also be liberating and helpful as well. I don't know, Stuart, if that answered your question, but I wish I had my daughter at my side for many reasons, but she could do a better job than I just did.
Well, thank you. Vitas, who's on the board of the Sam Hughes Neighborhood Association, has a question.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, David. This is a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
There's only one word that I kind of feel might not be the best word to use, and that is skillful speech. One can be skillful at speaking good things or saying really terrible things. Hitler was very skillful in his speech, riling up the mob, as was Donald Trump, still to this day. So I would probably avoid using the word skillful as a synonym for right, or good, or compassionate, or any of those things.
Oh, thank you. I mean, that is such a great point. And, none of these words do much more than point to something in communication,
Right.
It's really hard to express in language what we truly feel and what may really connect us to another person. Skillful speech, skillful might be the same as the Buddhist concept upaya. Skillful speech is speech that is an appropriate response. But if we think of skillful speech as a silver-tongued debater, then it's precisely off the mark. So I agree with you. These words can be really misleading. And I appreciate the corrective on that one.
Thank you. Where did this go?
David, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about where do we get purchase on the current situation with these concepts? Many of the people here, probably everyone, but I know many of them are engaged in certain actions on behalf of ecological integrity, on behalf of habitat restoration, on behalf of climate wisdom, and yet there's so many forces that are going against that. And I've thought about this a lot, so I have some thoughts of my own, but I'm very interested in your thoughts. Where are the purchase points? With whom do we practice this courage? Or to whom do we address the idea of speaking kindly and compassionately as well as courageously and strongly?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and it brings up so many different situations. What comes to my mind is a meeting I had recently in which I was quite sure the other persons at this meeting were my enemy, and they were surely as convinced that I was their enemy, which is to say that our objectives differed, that points I made in a public comment set them back. My biases and theirs. I think if we care about preserving life on Earth, it says something about how much we love life on Earth. And that includes the lives of those men and women across the table from us who believe strongly that what we want is going to cost them jobs, or what we want is going to make it harder for them to live a life that they have come to believe is their right, et cetera, et cetera. But somehow disabusing ourselves that the other side is wrong and our antagonist, and that we must persuade them to change their views, and showing them that we really are just like them in so many ways. We're sharing the same air, we're sharing the same water, we're raising families in the same communities, and so on. And how do you do that? I think it has to be authentic. I think it has to be, very real. But if we go into the public space where different views are in contest, and we think that we are going to prevail in the short term, in the long term, by undercutting our adversaries' arguments, making them look foolish, persuading them that they were wrong, mea culpa. Seldom have I seen that as an effective strategy. There's the short view and the long view, and I think it behooves us to take the long view when we're concerned about life on the planet, but to get on with it as quickly as possible.
Well, what you're saying reminds me of what they teach in the Harvard program on negotiation, which is if you want to work with these people again, then relationships are really important. And if relationships are important, then that means seeing that they may have some really good things to bring to the table that we just haven't thought about for a while.
Yeah.
And I'm putting words in your mouth perhaps, but it's the sense of your attitude that way becomes kind of a model for the conversation that
Mm,
creating a different tone in the room. So that leads to, I wonder whether you or anyone else here has more experience of that. It's fun to hear stories of how things turned around unexpectedly and
mm,
people walked out as friends, or at least as with a happy agreement and willing to work together again.
mm. Are there others who would like to share their experiences with that? Um, I just, where I first started practicing law, the story about the senior partner at the firm was that, he'd be an adversary in a case, the lawyer for one client, but that the highest compliment was when the case was over, the other side came to him and asked him to be his lawyer, or their lawyer. Um, and I don't know whether that's much more than being skillful or an effective advocate, but I think there was something. There was a human connection. Do you want to be right or do you want to be in connection? And there is a way to connect with people that says that you can be believed and you can be trusted. Um, Looks like maybe someone was weighing in with a comment.
Yeah, this is Audrey Juneman who said, how would you suggest climate advocates use right speech in their protest actions in this day and age?
Mhm. Wow. Um, well, that's a wonderful question. And I've tried to answer it in a very long-winded way with my talk this evening. I think it is very situational, and I think that communication is fraught with both promise and pitfalls. So, and it's important to communicate. It involves taking a little risk. I think to the extent people are reading newspapers, letters to the editor that are not laced with ad hominem attacks, vituperative speech, good guy versus bad guy language, but are really aimed more toward bringing a community together around life and sustaining life, those are going to be persuasive. Um, if you're on YouTube or social media, I think the same is true. If you show up at a public meeting, yeah, you want to do your homework. You need to know who's on the council, who will be making the decisions, et cetera, how much time you have to speak. Um, but do it in a way that is really consistent with the message you're trying to deliver. That's as I was thinking about this tonight, and Al and Mary Ellen surely will recognize some pieces of what I said from before, but I was really thinking of the ethics of care. And for environmentalists, sustainability advocates, um, it's all about an ethics of care. It's about caring for this planet and its survival. And if we can't figure out a way to communicate with that same level of care for the people who will be listening to us, um, there's going to be a gap that undercuts our credibility. I think the two are sort of should be coming from the same place. And our small selves can get in the way of effective and wise speech.
Thank you, David. That's helpful. And David Eisenberg would like to share something.
Well, I was thinking about the issue of relationships, the importance of relationships, actually, and how you view the potential to create one with an adversary. I was really fortunate. My father was incredibly good at separating people from issues. And I saw he was involved in all kinds of things. He was, for 12 years, he was the chair or co-chair of the Citizens Advisory Committee on Block Grant Funding for the city of Tucson. He knew all kinds of people engaged in all sorts of things, involved in civil rights and lots of other things. And I watched him get in pretty intense debates, arguments with people over issues, at the end of which he would invariably say, let's go get a cup of coffee. Let's go get a sandwich. He wasn't much of a drinker, but he would probably say, let's go get a beer. I was on a ASTM, American Society for Testing and Materials, standards developing committee. I was the vice chair of this committee, and it was the first committee on sustainability, sustainable performance of buildings, developing standards for that. There was a guy representing the Vinyl Institute who we continually would get into head-to-head arguments in those committee meetings. And one day, at the end of one of those arguments, I thought about my father. And so at the end of the meeting, I said to him, hey, you want to go get dinner? And he had this shocked look on his face. And he said, sure. And so we went out to dinner. And we had the committees met twice a year. And I did this for 5 years. Anyway, we developed this regular routine where we would, at the end of the day, one day during that committee week, we'd go out to dinner together and we talk about our families, all kinds of things, anything but what we dealt with on the committee. And over time, we developed a really good friendship. It was kind of weird. Some of my friends thought it was especially troubling. But when I went off that committee, I didn't hear from him for a long time. And then one day the phone rang and he said, well, the Vinyl Institute laid me off. And I have a question, which this may sound like a weird question, but because I was on the national board of the U.S. Green Building Council, he said, do you think that USGBC might hire me? And I said, well, I don't know, but I know who to ask and I'll put you in touch with them. And they didn't hire him. But the next time I talked to him, he had gotten a job working for a county in the DC area as a sustainability consultant to developers. And I thought when I ran into him and he was telling me what he was doing at that point, I thought, if I had not thought about my father and my father's way of being with adversaries, that could not have happened.
Yeah, such great points. I think we have to see one another. Sure, I really love the law, practicing the law, for some of those same reasons, David, that you mentioned. I was practicing in Phoenix. It was a relatively small legal community, and lawyers knew that they were going to see one another again. And a lot of times they might raise their families together. And so a lot of this hardball stuff wasn't happening. And all of that predates what's going on now, which is where you've got this lawfare taking place on behalf of one political view versus another, or one self-interest versus another, that makes it almost impossible to speak to someone on the other side without a witness or a tape recorder. I worked on the Hill 50 years ago, maybe. It's hard to believe, but at a time when, Democrats and Republicans went out to lunch together and they hung out together and they signed bills together. I worked for John Tunney from California, worked on a measure where Bob Dole was our co-sponsor. And we got like 98 US senators on board with this resolution. Today, if you're a member of one party or the other, you can't be seen socializing with the other side. That's a sea change from the way it used to be. It's not healthy. So I think, I don't know. Was it Toni Morrison who said, do you want to be remembered for what you did or for how you made people feel? And how you make people feel may or may not save the planet. But I'd put my money on it as a good bet.
There's lots in the chat that I could bring out. And before that, I'd like to comment. David, you had a story of when you shifted your focus and you were able, very much in the style that David has talked about, this spontaneous arising of right speech. And we can't take the whole thing, but I wonder if you can give us like the essence of what that was like for you.
But,
Sorry,
David?
David. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, please.
So I think maybe you're talking about my Phoenix talk at which was at a code annual conference of code officials, and I was supposed to have 10 minutes, or I was supposed to have 20 minutes, and it turned out we only had 10 minutes each, and I didn't have time to turn my 20-minute prepared talk into a 10-minute talk, and so I ended up having to get up in front of about, I don't know, 900 building officials, sort of cold, as the first speaker on this panel. And and I was going through, the points that I had prepared, and I suddenly realized that I'd used my 10 minutes, and that the ending that I had was dependent on the 10 minutes of stuff that I hadn't talked about. And this is sort of the classic public speaking nightmare. I'm staring out at this sea of building officials, not having any idea what to say. And while I was trying to figure out what to say, I realized I was already talking. And what I said was something I'd never thought before. So we all heard it for the first time at the same time, even though it was coming out of my mouth. And what I said was, I want to ask you a question. When someone comes into your jurisdiction and they want to do something crazy, like build a house out of bales of straw, or maybe they want to use the dirt and do adobe or rammed earth or cob, something you've never heard of, or maybe they think they should be able to use bamboo as a structural material. Maybe they want to harvest rainwater off the roof and drink it, or maybe they don't want to be connected to the sewer or septic system and have composting toilets, or maybe they don't want to be connected to the electrical grid and have photovoltaic panels and batteries. This was in 1997, so some of this stuff was more out there than it is now. Anyway, I said, what goes through your mind when people come in and ask for permission to do this kind of stuff? And I said, my first thought is, what I think your first thought is that these people should be protected from themselves. And there was laughter. And I said, and your second thought is not in my jurisdiction. And there was more laughter. And I said, now I want you to think about what's really going on, because it's really important. The vast majority of those people coming in wanting to do those things have made a crucial discovery, which is that their lifestyle choices have consequences, many, if not most of which are negative, but not negative for them, negative for their children and their children's children and my children and your children. And I said, what those people are trying to do is take responsibility for the decisions that they're making. I said, is there anyone in this room who thinks that's a bad thing? I said, I don't think so. So I said, so what's your job as a building official? Is it to keep those people from pursuing that goal, or is it to help them find the way to do it well and safely? And I thought, shut up, sit down. And so I thanked them and I sat down to incredible applause. And I sat there thinking, what just happened? Like, how in the last 2 minutes of a 10-minute talk to this big room full of building officials did I cut through all the resistance that I imagined would be there? And I realized the first thing I realized was I didn't tell them anything. I asked them questions, really good questions. But I also didn't make them bad or wrong. What I really did was call them to a higher place from which to do their work. And that changed me. That talk made me realize that code officials were not my adversaries, that I wanted what they wanted and more, not less, because I had a bigger field of view, a bigger set of hazards that I was thinking about than the ones that they were focused on. And that I was basically asking them to, take a look at a larger set of responsibilities than the ones they were used to doing.
Mm-hmm.
Was that the story you wanted?
Yes, thank you, David Eisenberg. Thank you. I think we all appreciate um, the story, what you did, and also your explanation, which leads in a way to something that Steve Brown put up in a chat. He talked about there was let me just find this. After 9/11, the Interfaith Council in his county, where he lived at the time, sponsored a series of civil discourse sessions. And this is about another angle on right speech. In a big college auditorium, we were asked to turn to someone we didn't know and ask two questions. What do you fear might happen to you if those you disagree with prevail? And the second question was, what do you think that the person you disagree with fears would happen to them if your point of view prevailed? And then there was discussion. So asking people to think about their biggest hopes and fears, and and each get a chance.
Yeah. Well, it does remind me of a central truth about settlement of disputes. And that is, the more we know about the other side's position, the greater the likelihood that we get to an equitable or fair result. And so if one participant in a settlement negotiation is holding their position very close and they're revealing very little, it's going to be hard really to get to that place where compromise is possible, settlement of a dispute is possible. And, you know, I think settlements are a very good thing, at least in the legal world. The lawyers benefit from protracted litigation. The litigants, on the other hand, it's a nightmare. So how do you get people to yes as quickly and inexpensively as possible? One way is to learn as much as you can from the other side without making it as painful, without making it painful for them to express themselves.
I'll take that as a opening for the first announcement. Some of you who are here tonight already know that a follow-up to this talk will happen in 2 months in July with someone from the Harvard Project on negotiation. And she's going to give a picture of a way they think about what they call the mutual gains approach, which is what you're, David Bodney, you've been talking about. How can we mutually gain? And David Eisenberg, your story was all about how can we mutually gain from this situation? And one of the concepts is distinguishing between interests and positions. Positions we need to know about, but really what are the interests those positions are trying to satisfy? And that's where it's easier to find common ground. And so just knowing the distinction is a very valuable thing. And Stephen, it looks like Stephen Mankey's got a question or a story to tell.
I was more of a question. Uh, David's story was very apropos because he was in the room. I think we have problems nowadays getting into the room with the people that we really need to convince.
Mm.
And so I would challenge all of us to look at methodology a bit. How do we get to the place where we can say the questions that we really want to discuss?
Mhm.
Stephen, oh, that has been an intent in the Renew Tucson enterprise. And it sounds like we're on the way, but not there. Maybe some people would like to hear more about that.
Well, the Renew Tucson enterprise, I think, was designed to try and bring people into a room so we could get these questions asked. And I think we were partially successful, but we were still speaking in a room where most everybody was already convinced of the path. And I'm wondering about how do we get to the people who we might need to have cooperate that didn't come to the Renew Tucson, and how do we widen that audience? And I'm not quite sure how to do that. I know the communication systems we have nowadays, social media or the written or email things or ads, all tend to get filtered through everybody's bubble. And I'm not quite sure how to solve that problem, because then you can do right speech, but you have to sort of be next to the people who you need to be with. And that's a big problem for me.
Mm.
I think of Bonnie Went. She was the director of a camp in the Santa Cruz Mountains of Monterey Bay
Mhm.
area in California.
Mhm.
Psychologist who I think deserved the honor of that name. She understood people. And I noticed as a very young camp counselor that whoever came up the drive, she walked out of her office like this with her hand outstretched and a big smile. And she would shake hands. That could be someone delivering food. It could be a neighbor who came and had a complaint. It could be a father of a camper who was dressed in a jumpsuit and looked like he was, who knows what he was up to. And just every person, she smiled, and that was her greeting. And so that expectation, I think that's what you were talking, David Bodney, about before, that the expectation is this person could be my friend. This person is like me.
Mhm.
And just starting with that expectation makes our invitations more attractive. But I'd sure love to hear from more people if anyone wants to help the Renew Tucson folks. How do we get more people in? Lee, did you want to say something?
Well, yeah, my first immediate thought was just literally invite them, with a phone call or a written invitation. Maybe not just email, maybe a snail mail invitation. Um, if you really want to get, like, say, I don't know if you want to go as far as Copper World or Project Blue or any of those entities, but yeah, that's what I was thinking in terms of the Renew Tucson. The first thought that came to me was, well, invite them, literally invite them, and maybe that would work. I don't know.
I'm not sure if Skip Leitner is still here. He did a lot of that actually, and there were some people who at least got interested, even if they didn't.
Good. I found out about it after it was over. Otherwise, I would have been interested.
Well, you'll hear about more. We'll be having a celebration probably the end of July.
Great.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. So we're on sort of the last lap here, and this is often the time when that thing that someone just hadn't thought of until right now that comes up. It's like when you say goodbye at the door after a party, then oh, there's this one other thing. So here's our chance. David, Bodney, maybe you'd like to give us in 1 or 3 sentences sort of the summary you'd like us to take home, and that might just knock something loose from our brains.
When we could all hear the Columbo question, just
What's the
one
Columbo
more,
question?
just one more thing.
Oh,
The detective Peter Falk is Columbo, right before he left the scene of the crime. Yeah, I just I- for me, speech is a really powerful thing. I think it has so much wonderful potential to bring people together, and it has so much destructive capacity as well. And for that reason, I think it's really important for us to be grounded in certain values, to have that moral clarity when we're in conversation with other people. Are you curious? Do you want to know what the other side thinks? Are you really interested in accomplishing something? Or is this all about satisfying an ego? Is this about chalking up another win? Is it for some kind of outcome that is going to change anyway? So how do we comport ourselves as human beings in the exercise of our advocacy? I'm thinking of the Voting Rights Act. How many people, what a landmark win that was in 1965, and what a horrible day it was for all those who believe in the Voting Rights Act just a few weeks ago when the Supreme Court eviscerated that law. Things change, but I think people remember John Lewis for some courageous speech, no matter the outcome of that particular legislation. Having the courage of our convictions to march when it's time to march, and to be silent when it's time to listen and know the difference between the two, all in connection with, a beloved community, because that's what we got.
Mhm.
That's what merits, nurturing along with our planet.
thank you. Lee.
Could I just ask one thing?
Yeah.
Just one more thing. The problem is, for me at least, is being triggered. And, seeing people who, quote, are on the other side. Sorry, my camera's not being very, who are, quote, on the other side, and it seems clear that they're not operating from a place of morality or ethics, and they promote violence. And so now let's be clear, I'm not directly interacting with any of these people. But they are interacting with our society. And there are people who follow them and agree with them. And so I get angry,
Mhm.
and you were talking about the news and you turning it off, and like I have gone back and forth on that because I just every single time I read the newspaper, especially the editorial pages, I'll read something and or not even the editorial pages, just the headlines. I get so angry.
Mm.
Um, and so like how to handle, I guess that's an instance in which better not say anything because I'm really angry.
Mm.
And I don't believe these people are good people.
Mm.
And how do you, how can we
Mm.
reconcile that with kind speech?
Yeah.
That's what I struggle with.
Yeah, I think we all do to one degree or another. I was on a phone call with my older brother this morning who said, I just can't look at him. I can't
Oh,
listen to his
yeah.
voice. I
Oh, I
can't
don't,
hear,
me neither.
yeah. And it was, too easy for me to say, then don't. Just don't. Um, it's the balance between staying informed on the
Hmm.
one hand
Yeah.
and becoming angry, triggered, or disengaged, on the other. I try not to see the other person as a thing who is evil or immoral or, you know, solid in a fixed way that is terrible. Um, People do some awful things. So I try as best I can to distinguish between the actor and the action and
Hmm.
have a place in my heart
Hmm.
for the actor because we know that person deep down inside is suffering and causing a lot of suffering. And rather than just dwell on that kind of analysis, which is really beyond my, as they say, pay grade, I think about then how do we transform the anger? How do we
Hmm.
leaven the anger with a certain measure of patience and then transform it into something constructive? And that
Hmm.
comes from a loving place where then you get out and you say, we're going to work to build this. We're going to work to replace that candidate with this other candidate. We're going to work for elected officials who care about the environment and support, this particular solution. And we'll put our shoulders to the wheel and in a constructive way fight for change rather than allowing ourselves to just get spun up into how terrible it is. And
Hmm.
for environmentalists, um, then it's time for that walk in the woods.
Yeah.
Walden Thoreau, was arrested, on his way to look for huckleberries. Um, and he was, discovered, oh, that's the guy we want. And then he spends his night in jail. Um, I was reading an essay by Rebecca Solnit written some time ago about balancing, the advocate for nature with the experience of being in the natural world.
Hmm.
So I would say if you find yourself hitting that saturation point, put a smile on your face, turn it off, go outside and listen to the songbirds for a while. Mhm. That always
That
works for
is
me.
brilliant. Yep. That is
Well,
brilliant
I have
advice.
a I have a good teacher.
And
Thank you
Steve,
very much.
Thank you.
thank you, Lee, for asking. Let's find out whether Stephen would like to compliment what.
Yeah, he's David got to where I was intending to go, which is when you live in an environment of fear, you don't look for the source of the fear, you just react to the fear. And you have to take that time out to remember that fear comes from a place of uncertainty. And that person that you fear or who fears you is not really certain about how they feel about the world. They're scared too. And their reaction is born out of that. So I think he's right. You have to say, okay, where can I find kindness in that person?
And Al Kosniak, you've been keeping the code of silence, but I know you've spoken about this yourself. If you would like to add a few words, please feel free to unmute.
Thank you so much, Stuart. And great appreciation to David Bodney and to everybody else who has spoken. I guess the only other thing I would add is that, we can speak about, finding that place of loving kindness where we can connect to another human being. And there's sometimes that I think that's a bridge too far for us. That's a stretch, because we, as Lee was saying, it can be so hard to find. Maybe a little less of a stretch is to find something that we can respect. And I think very often that first step in finding connection is to identify some small point of respect. And in communicating that, opening a door for the mutuality of respect. So thanks very much, Stuart.
Yeah, thank you, Al. And Dan Stormont, reinforcing the recommendation to get outdoors, he said everyone needs to take time to touch grass, or here in Tucson, touch chuparosa. Whatever's out there, go out and stroke the Palo Verde. And I think, David, and I've heard you, Al, speak about this before, that you've used the word pause, even to notice what's happening in the body. That's actually very useful. William Ury, not time to tell the story now, but he described an interview with Hugo Chavez when he was mediating a conflict between an opposition group and the Venezuelan government. And he gave a report which he thought was a reasonable report to Hugo Chavez at midnight. And Chavez just rejected it entirely, and he just started shouting in his face. And this is a man who was known to give 8-hour speeches. And William Ury said, fortunately, I had spent some time before coming in the room, just feeling inside and just knowing how I was feeling, a little anxious about the conversation, but I did a little relaxation. And so when Chavez started talking, I could feel the change in my physiology. I could feel my cheeks flush. I could feel my heart rate increase. I could feel something rising up. And just feeling that, he was able to be with the experience. And so that's what Dogen talked about, the continuous practice. If we train ourselves to listen to how we're feeling and just be with that, that happens to be, as I understand it, that a core Zen practice, you just sit there and just be with your awareness. And after a while, you get kind of accustomed to having that template to make reference to. Not always, but more often. Not completely, but sometimes enough to lower the temperature a little bit.